Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. We Americans have a thing about freedom, the deepest wellspring of American freedom, though, not ours by virtue of being American. They're actually ours by virtue of being human. If there is a genius in our political tradition, it lies in a remarkable political system that we have not devised ourselves, but only inherited from an intellectual and spiritual heritage that's way greater than ourselves. Joining me to have a conversation about this is Stephen White. Stephen is the Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America and a Fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Stephen, great to speak with you again. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's always good to be with you, Marcus.
It's been a while. I do enjoy it whenever we reconnect, and I want to begin by talking about that concept of freedom and how we ought to understand it within a natural law context and, to be fair, a Catholic intellectual context as well.
Yeah, freedom, as we mean freedom in lots of different ways when we talk about it. And I think these days it's common for us to think about freedom as a freedom from constraints, right? What are the things that limit my ability to do what I want? But as you were saying in the introduction, the freedom that we have is not unlimited. There are limits on what we can do. Freedom has to be tied to truth, to the truth about who we are. And that means that there are some things that we ought not to do. There are some things we cannot do. Gravity sees to that. And so to understand our freedom as freedom from limits is to miss that often the constraints that we find upon ourselves are not limits to our freedom, but are the conditions for our exercising our freedom fully. It seems almost like a paradox, but that reflection, I think, is a fruitful one, that the limits that we find in our own lives, the limits on our ability to do things, sometimes even what we want, are not always limits on freedom, but actually the conditions for our freedom being used well.
Now, that language of freedom being used well presupposes a concept of morality, especially amongst the founders, a shared concept of morality as a system that holds all mankind accountable. If I may ask you to speak to that as well.
Yeah, well, I think before it was a system of morality, I think it's a system of human nature. There's an anthropology that underlies it. We often talk about freedom in moral or ethical terms. What am I allowed to do? What ought I to do? And that's important, obviously. That's one of the reasons we talk about that so often is because that's so often how our freedom it plays out. That's the relevant conversation to our questions of freedom. But I think if there was a genius to our founding, and I think there was, it was a recognition of what a human being is, that he might be free, and therefore, what might be the conditions for preserving or exercising that freedom well. So there's a deeper anthropology that underlies it, and the founders didn't get everything correct. But their concept of who the human person was, what it means to be not just an individual, but a part of a community, a political community, we the people, laid the foundation for a pretty remarkable system. I know it seems kind of broken some days, but what it has accomplished and the foundations upon which it were built are truly remarkable and worth looking more closely at. But also, they're worthy of a kind of gratitude, that it's not by accident that this conception of human freedom is at the founding of our nation and of our political life. And that's something that doesn't happen automatically. And it's not something that, once established, sort of preserves itself of its own accord. It takes recognition from us citizens and work from us citizens to understand what that means, how we ought to live within that system, and how to preserve it and pass it on, because it's something we've inherited. I wasn't one of the founders. I didn't sign the Declaration of Independence. I was born into American citizenship, as most American citizens are. It's a gift. You might even say it was sort of imposed on us. Not all impositions are bad. And so this what I've called the custodial nature of citizenship is important, because it's something we have received. We're responsible for it and to one another as part of it, and we're responsible for preserving it and passing it on as well.
As you rightly highlight, this concept of a custodial nature, it overflows from a virtuous sense of patriotism, appreciation for the gift that has been given. But like you've mentioned, this is an imposition to be sure. I'm an immigrant to this nation. I chose it willingly and lovingly. My children, through no fault of their own or choice of their own, are now American citizens. And but it's a good imposition. They are the result of the choice I made for their good. So explain to us then the virtuous onus of this custodial nature, the character.
Yeah, well, there are lots of good things like the citizenship being one, but I think of my own Catholic faith, right? I was born into it. I was baptized. I was raised Catholic before I had done any idea of what that meant. And that's not an imposition. That's something I'm tremendously grateful for. And I think, when we think about freedom in the political sense, one is to try and get a sense of a broader sense of freedom. That freedom is not just a freedom from limits, as important as that is. I think that's not a false view of freedom, but it's only a partial view of freedom. When God freed his people from bondage in Egypt, that wasn't a false sense of freedom. It was a real kind of freedom, but there's more to it than simply being unfettered, even literally. And the virtues of citizenship, you mentioned patriotism, the work of being a good citizen, of being responsible to and for your neighbor, that requires constant work. And it's not work that can be accomplished, again, by accident. It requires a kind of focus. It requires a training, a learning. There's a school of good citizenship and virtue of how to live civic life well that we need to pay closer attention to. We can't just all sort of assert our own desires or assert our own will and expect everything to turn out in the end. It requires a real commitment to doing something together, that kind of civic mindedness. And that requires acknowledging limits on what we can do and not do. It requires being grateful for those limits, because if otherwise what you have is just sort of a kind of rebellion. It's the false promise from the garden, right? That if you disobey God, if you disobey the limits that were imposed on you for your own sake, if you disobey that, then you will be like gods, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not how that ends. That's the temptation. That's the lie. And so that working within our limits, acknowledging them, and even being grateful for them is a really important first step, not only in exercising political freedom, but freedom in every other aspect of our life as well.
As we talk more about this concept of exercising freedom in our life, one of the things that we also understand is, especially in the thought of the framers, there was a presupposition that this freedom, which is acknowledged as a right of bearers of the divine image, was also going to be united with each individual's accountability that they would hold of themselves towards God, who would be the ultimate judge. I wonder if you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which human freedom that doesn't come from the state can't ever be guaranteed by the state, right? So that if our rights, properly understood, ultimately come from God, that they stem from our innate or natural obligations, our innate dignity as creatures made in God's image. If they don't come from government, then they have to extend beyond what government can demand or require, which means that there are elements of good citizenship, elements of a healthy politics in the broadest sense, that extend beyond sort of the limits of what law can be made to do. I think it was Madison who said, I'm getting confused now. He said that, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's
John Adams.
Unsuited there you go. It's totally unsuitable for anyone else. And I think that's important, is that just because we have certain political freedoms, we have to live in a way that is worthy of those freedoms. You have to be capable of living freely in order to enjoy your freedom.
My guest is Stephen White, Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, Fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and brilliant thinker when it comes to the question of living out our faith in this case, civic life. Continuing on the other side, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm talking with Stephen White, Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, Fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We are talking about freedom. Freedom without truth is no true freedom. So, Stephen, as you've been rightly sharing with us, this whole notion of freedom being quote unquote guaranteed by the state is simply a misunderstanding because the state can't actually give us what it doesn't have the right to, which means that the very source of our freedom comes from an authority greater than the state itself.
Yes, that's right. And it's not that the state is the antithesis of freedom. Mm-hmm. If you want to lose your freedom, go for anarchy, right? That's not a condition in which we can have our freedom protected or our rights protected, or that we can live as well as we are meant to be able. So the important thing is not to oppose freedom and government, or oppose freedom in the state, but just to see that the apparatus of government is a necessary but insufficient condition for human freedom lived well. And I think that puts the onus for living our freedom well on us citizens, not just to do what we ought, but to recognize that living well, living virtuously, is in a way the best guarantor of our own freedom. We can't expect some other institution, whether it's the state or even the church or the family or anything like that, to guarantee our freedom. We're only free insofar as we live our freedom well. And doing that isn't something law can force us to. It can help or it can hinder, but it can't accomplish it on its own.
You bring up an extremely important point in that conversation, therefore, which is, what does it mean to live well? What does it mean for virtue to be a natural overflow of the free life?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, ultimately the greatest of all the virtues is charity, right? And that's not something that we generally associate with law. But it's hard to live charitably if you're in a lawless place. So, again, the constraints that we have, not just from the state, but think of all the obligations that we have, the institutions that surround us, that shape us, that form us, that provide for us. Family, the church, and the state are sort of what has been called by Russ Hittinger the three necessary societies. So you can't live a fully human life without those, really. Those institutions all put limits and constraints on us. It's easy to see that when it comes to law and the state, the political community, but it's true of the church too, and it's true of family. We talked earlier about citizenship being something that many of us were born into, right? It's imposed upon us, as it were. The same is true of family. We think of family hopefully as a place of love and of security. We don't choose our families. We are born into a family. We don't choose. Parents generally don't choose their children. We pretend we can now to a certain degree through selective abortion or through manipulation of genetic code to try and get the children we want. But these aren't pets; these are people. And so I think in attempting to break free from the limits of the givenness of human life and ordinary human institutions, whether that's the state or the family or the church, we run into a kind of false freedom where we're trying to free ourselves of what we see as unnatural or unnecessary restraints. But what we're really doing is eroding the conditions that are necessary for our exercise of freedom. Charity can't be exercised in a human way if we don't have any limits to our willfulness, right? Even God made himself vulnerable in becoming man. And we are not God, so we don't have unlimited freedom. If we try and live as if we do, bad things happen. That's true in political life, it's true in family life, it's true everywhere else. So I think the one of the points I wanted to emphasize is that these limits, which can be frustrating, family life can be hard, politics can be exhausting, it can make us cynical at times, it can even be violent at times. The church, our mother, is full of sinners who do things that frustrate and exasperate and disappoint us all the time. But we are still bound to those institutions, and we still depend on them. We require them for the exercise and the fulfillment of our own vocations and for the exercise and use of our own freedom. And I think understanding how the becoming the people that we were made to become the people that God made us to be, intends us for us to be, means living within these restraints, which we can see as constraints on ourselves, but I think it's better often to see them as gifts, right? That they give shape to our life, they give context to our vocation, and so not just accepting the world as it is in sort of a cynical way, but learning to see the things, the ties that bind us as the precondition of our freedom and flourishing rather than as an opposition to it.
As you rightly mentioned, therefore, there's an onus then that's placed on the free man to undergo that work, in the intellectual work of learning what this system of virtue entails, whether social or personal, and then choosing the good life. So there's an intellectual moral work that has to be taken on by each individual simply by virtue of being a member of a polis.
Yeah, that's right. And the ancients understood that mere willfulness wasn't really freedom. It was servitude. We become slavish to our own passions and to our own willfulness, right? We could become less free. In Christian language, we talk about being chained to sin, right? And Aristotle talked about, in his Politics, he talks about, the one who can survive outside of the city, outside of the polis, outside of the political community is either a beast or a god. And what he meant was if we're really independent, really, truly self-sufficient, then we're not men, right? We're some other higher creation. And if we cannot, or we are worse than that. And we know, you recall the false promise in the garden, like, if you disobey, you will become like gods. We know that that's a lie, and it's not one that was made up by Aristotle. And the other condition is that if we try and make ourselves self-sufficient, we will fall short of being gods for sure, but we will become beastly. We will become less humane, and in doing so, we'll become less free, less able to live in accord with the dignity of our vocation and the beauty of the life as it was given to us and as God wills for us.
Now, that dignity is lived out best when we understand that ultimately the virtuous life conveys to us that this life isn't about ourselves. Human flourishing within the societal sphere is ordered towards this concept of the common good. So, in other words, freedom is for the sake of human flourishing and the common good. I know that's really wide, but can you please unpack that for our listeners?
Yeah, our freedom is made for the common good. The things that we have, we are given to share, as not my favorite song ever goes. If you know that hymn,
no.
But I think it's really true, and it's not just that our freedom depends upon broader institutions like the family and the church and political society, though it does. Our flourishing depends on those things, but is that our freedom becomes fullest, and our virtue, the perfections that we call virtues, are found in living for the sake of that common good, right? That the things that we share with one another are the most important things, and they're not used up by our sharing them. Love is not diminished by it being shared. It, in fact, grows. We can't love if we are alone, right? Even God, who is perfect and self-sufficient, is a community of persons. So if we strive for self-sufficiency, if we strive to be freed from all of the things that constrain us, that make demands on our time, and that we are responsible to, if we try and liberate ourselves from that, we won't, in fact, be liberated. We'll be alone and imperfect and much less happy. And
that's precisely why we're so miserable. I think at some point we forgot that there's a cost to freedom, and that cost isn't a terrible price to pay. In fact, it's the only remedy for societal happiness and, frankly, individual happiness.
Yeah, and I think one of the curious things to me is that Americans in general are, by historical standards, so wealthy, and our technology is so powerful that we convince ourselves at times that we can actually live without solidarity, without being sort of in this deep web and mesh of social and familial and personal ties.
Mm-hmm.
We convince ourselves that we can do without that. many years ago, a long time ago on the frontier, for example, when Americans were making their way west from the East Coast, if you lived that way, you died. You froze to death, right? You had to be a good neighbor and expect and to make demands on your neighbors, not unjust demands, but we rely on one another. And I think we're comfortable enough now to kid ourselves and to make ourselves believe that we can live in a more self-sufficient way, and it makes us miserable. And the more miserable we get, I think often our response is not to sort of take stock of what's around us and return to what we ought to be doing, but to strain even harder against the things that we see as restraints, which are really the sort of the conditions of our own freedom and happiness.
Stephen, as usual, it's such a joy to connect with you, and we're running out of time in this segment. So very quickly then, as an exhortation, I mean, we are entering into the 250th anniversary of our wondrous nation. Catholics listening, an exhortation to understanding what virtue, freedom, and holiness ought to look like.
Growing in holiness is the greatest thing any citizen can do for his country. We need citizen saints. I know that might sound corny, it might sound hokey, but our politics is built in a way that it depends on our own goodness and virtue. So focusing on living virtues in community, in our families, in our local neighborhoods, is not going to grab headlines, but it's one of the most important things that we do, and it's something that we're all responsible for doing.
Stephen, that was perfect. And far from hokey, I actually appreciate it. That was stunning. My guest has been Stephen White, Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America, and a fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And his exhortation to us is that we need to be citizen saints. Growing in holiness is, quite frankly, one of the best ways we can serve our nation. Stay tuned for the next hour. I'm Marcus Peter.